Stop. Do it again. Keep both hands on your weapon. But I can't reach her, Captain. You can, Ludmilla said. You have over 2 meters of reach even with both hands on your weapon. That is more than enough to land a solid hit. MMH. On the training grounds of the Royal Army Base in Warden's Vale, Ludmilla walked up and down her row of ranger recruits as they sparred with their quarterstaves. She stopped to observe the boy she had just addressed. He was paired with a juvenile orc who stood just over 2 meters in height, but lacked the bulk of an adult. The boy, Cornelio, made an aggressive set of attacks. At the end of his offensive, however, he still couldn't get past his opponent's weapon. Ila's too tall, Cornelio panted. Her arms are longer than mine. If you let me lunge, I could score a point. Then go ahead and try, Ludmilla said. Cornelio and Ila once again assumed their stances. Their weapons clacked against one another as Cornelio probed for an opening. After several light exchanges, he suddenly released his left hand on his weapon and threw himself into a picturesque-looking lunge. At its full extension, it would have allowed him to strike at a target around 4 meters away, but Ila merely swatted the weapon aside and brought her own down on her opponent's shoulder. Cornelio went down in a heap, groaning in pain. Glazer, Ludmilla called. Coming, Tilda. Glazer's sweet voice drifted in from the other end of the row of trainees. She knelt beside the fallen boy and examined him for a moment. Your collarbone is broken, the Dryad said. You think? Cornelio said through his gritted teeth. You humans are so fragile, Glazer gave the boy a poke. How would you feel if your bones got broken? I'm a Dryad. I don't have any bones. The familiar glow of healing magic washed over Cornelio. He pushed himself back up to his feet, looking more annoyed than anything else. Overall, injuries of that severity happened a few dozen times a day, mostly because the new trainees hadn't figured out how to hold back yet. When you lunge, Ludmilla said, you sacrifice control and leverage for reach. It might seem like a good idea, but it usually never is. Your opponent will easily take control of your weapon and then they are free to do whatever they want with you. Then I can't beat her, Cornelio grumbled. She's taller, stronger, and heavier. We can't do anything about that. Ila may be everything that you say she is, Ludmilla told the boy, but she is still subject to the same rules as everyone else. Understanding how your weapon works is the first step to defeating your opponents. Cornelio frowned down at his quarterstaff before picking it up off of the ground. Most people believe that the advantage of a polearm is in its reach and power. Ludmilla cast her voice over the row of trainees. But that does not fully explain how the weapon works. A polearm's versatility and leverage are what makes it the king of the battlefield. Do we need this training at all, Captain? Another student asked. We have bows. Rangers are skirmishers, Ludmilla replied. You must be proficient in both ranged and melee combat. Taking down an opponent at range may seem ideal, but you will not always find yourselves in ideal circumstances for ranged combat. In more than a few cases, engaging in melee combat may even be preferable. Then how do I beat her? Cornelio asked. Ila, Ludmilla said. Assume your defensive stance again. The orc nodded, gripping the lower third of her staff and threatening her opponent with the opposite end. Ludmilla called for the other students to observe. I believe everyone here should be familiar with levers from helping their families around the house, she said. Levers also form out of body parts and weapons. Your arms, legs, feet, and even fingers function as levers. Ila's quarterstaff is also a lever. When considered as such, where would one pull on the lever to exert the most force? The end of it, a student down the line said. Cornelio, Ludmilla said, give the lever a pull. Ila, do your best to hold the staff still. Cornelio came forward, leaning his staff against his shoulder so he could grip the end of the orc's weapon. He gave it a yank. It seemingly moved without resistance. Ila furrowed her brow, grunting in effort as she tried to regain control of her weapon. Cornelio's eyes widened as he released one hand and discovered that he was still able to overpower the orc. Now, Ludmilla said, try it with your weapon. By then, several other pairs of students were already experimenting with their own staves. Cornelio tested several grips before figuring out how much leverage he needed to control the end of Ila's weapon with his. Captain, Ila asked, if I apply the same knowledge, won't we go back to the original problem? No, Ludmilla answered. Your raw physical strength will give you an inherent advantage, But, now that everyone is exploring the principles that drive their weapons, they will always be aware that options exist to counter or at least mitigate your advantage. In your case, initiating a grapple is the best action against a much weaker opponent in single combat, unless they're a monk or something similar. I see, the orc nodded. That makes sense. I can just trample them while they puzzle out how to deal with my weapon. For now, Ludmilla said. As everyone gets stronger, the relative gap in power between you will shrink and you'll have many techniques and martial arts at your disposal. The key to learning those, however, is a strong martial foundation and the mental and physical discipline to go along with it. The average orc had double the physical strength of the average human, making them similar to the beastmen that had invaded the Holy Kingdom. She supposed that they were beastmen, after all. Ela's growth relative to her fellow rangers was a topic of keen interest to Ludmilla. Was she better off growing as a ranger, orc, or some mix between the two? Could her racial class growth even be controlled? Unless orcs were a sort of natural warrior, it would be a trade-off between raw physical attributes with a handful of other natural advantages and access to a greater variety of job class perks. Ludmilla had the trainee rangers continue experimenting with their new knowledge until the end of the morning session. Once the class was dismissed, she rode back to the harbor village on a passenger wagon with Glazer. How much mana did you use this time? Ludmilla asked. About half, Glazer said. We are practicing ritual magic this evening, so it shouldn't be a problem. What about your work around the village? It's been pretty quiet since the temple staff moved in. I've only been asked to do little things here and there. The rest of the time, I've been working on setting up new plots. Once they arrived at the village, they disembarked from the carriage and stepped onto a wagon lot that was now decorated by Glazer's plots of dirt. Patches of grass and small wildflowers added a bit of color to the gray granite expanse of the harbor's bedrock, which was not only appreciated by the citizens, but also by the local wildlife. Ludmilla and Glazer stopped to watch several bees forage through a patch of blue clover blossoms. If things continued as they were, a small apiary for the village wouldn't be out of the question next spring. Are you enjoying your work? Ludmilla asked. It's fun, Glazer replied. I know people think that I'm just throwing dirt around, but there's a lot of logic to it. At least everyone seems to like what I'm doing. How long is your list of colonizers now? Outside of the ones that Lord Mayor brought out here, 8. Those kids are super picky. Most of Glazer's free time was spent wandering the length and breadth of Ludmilla's territory, looking for plants and invertebrates that were compatible with the divine ash ecology they were trying to establish in the harbor. As the Dryad had mentioned, the plants that Lord Mayor dropped off to raise alongside Glazer's tree had a major say in which of the local flora could grow alongside them. Even the soil that they grew in contained elements that made it difficult or outright impossible for many of the local species to survive. We will just have to keep looking, Ludmilla said. Having only a couple of dozen plant species in an environment is too few. Maybe we can have plants or seeds imported from other regions to see how well they fare. Is that safe? Glazer asked. You are the harbor's custodian, Ludmilla said. What do you think? The harbor will be its own biome, so I'm not too worried about that, but stuff that we bring in might escape and spread to the rest of Warden's Vale. The river might transport alien species to the lands downstream, as well. I don't think it's safe to bring in species from other parts of the world until we have enough druids and rangers patrolling the area to keep an eye out for them. Ludmilla smiled and patted Glazer on her leafy head. She was indeed shaping up to be an excellent custodian for the harbor. Then it sounds like a plan, Ludmilla said. Hopefully one that we can enact within a generation. Speaking of invasive species, where do you sit on the circle's debate? The telltale tread of Glazer's Death Knight accompanied them as they made their way into the village. Most of the citizens appeared to be enjoying lunch in the warm summer air, seating themselves around the shaded wooden tables set up across the lanes from the storefronts. I'm on the natural side, Glazer said. Intelligent species are still a part of nature, so anything that they do can be considered a part of natural processes. The difference between a bird eating berries and spreading the seeds far from the parent plant and intelligent races purposely planting the seeds for agriculture is that people can purposely pick and choose where everything goes and how much they want of it. Either way, it's the result of a survival strategy on the part of the berry bush combined with the behaviors of those who interact with them. There are those who would take that rationale as a justification to do anything they want, Ludmilla noted. even to the point where they ruin the land and thus any prospects of living off of it for themselves and future generations. Then the death of those people is also natural, Glaser replied. It's a failure of the systems that they use and the behaviors that stem from them. Failures become fertilizer. Ludmilla stifled a laugh at the Dryad's matter-of-fact reasoning. While said failures are in the process of failing, Ludmilla said, they may be adversely affecting the survival of others who are connected to them in one way or another. Then those others should eliminate them, Glaser shrugged. It's only natural. Actually, it doesn't make sense that anyone would do what you said, though. Only unintelligent animals mindlessly do things until their environment is ruined. Who's doing this? Rather than any particular person, I would say that societies advance to the point where people no longer understand the effect that their activity has on the world beyond the small piece of it that they are exposed to. At least in my experience, no one ever lights their house on fire and wonders why there is a pile of ashes where their house used to be a day later. I don't really understand. Good afternoon, milady. Dame Glaser. They exchanged greetings with a passing group of villagers on their way across the square. From the sound of things, it was shaping up to be another uneventful day. The end of summer was already well on its way, so many of the activities in Warden's Vale were focused on the coming harvest. A row of new granaries had been built in the warehouse district and an additional berth was having its machinery installed in anticipation of increased freight traffic to Corlin Harbor. I believe by now you understand that many do not live as Dryads do, Ludmilla said. Even with the simple economy in Warden's Vale, individuals can only vaguely grasp how the goods and services that enter their lives come to be. To most, there are only needs and how one goes about fulfilling those needs. You mean all the things they sell in the shops? Glaser asked. For simplicity's sake, yes, Ludmilla answered. Take food, for instance. In a city, almost all of the provisions that its citizens need to survive are imported from rural regions. The citizens understand that grain comes from farms, but this merely becomes an abstraction unless they're directly involved in the supply chain. What matters to most is that they can get food from the market, a bakery, or some other establishment. As the city's population grows, it demands more and more food. What do you think happens then? Glaser looked over at the shops across the square. They compete for resources. The weak will starve or get eaten and equilibrium will be established. Unfortunately not, Ludmilla smiled slightly. You are correct about the competition part, but competition is fundamentally different in urban settings. One does not hunt, forage, fish, or farm, they work. Compensation is provided in exchange for work. Some people receive greater compensation and have an easier time procuring resources. The vast majority will work harder in the hopes that better compensation will help them survive. Eating fellow citizens usually gets one in trouble with the law, but people may resort to stealing resources from others, which I suppose can be interpreted as raiding. Wild animals do the same thing, Glaser noted. You are correct, Ludmilla said, and that is my point. Many believe that intelligence and technological advancement cause one to rise above their base nature. The truth is that they are still bound by it. Worse yet, populations take on the characteristics of their members' natures, making it difficult for individuals to control. They gain a collective appetite that places its demands on a region. Innovations that enhance the efficiency of economic and industrial activity give a population both a productiveness and reach that dwarfs the means of any single tribal unit. So populations become like animals themselves? It can be seen like that. With or without governance, populations will seek to expand their capacity to support themselves using the systems and practices available to them. A hungry mouth in our winter will fell a forest on the imperial frontier without either side ever realizing what is compelling them to behave as they do. In this state, the result is a purposeful, yet mindless civilization. Is that why government exists? Glaser asked. The humans here could behave like that and they probably do to some degree, but they have a warden to set boundaries to protect the rest of the territory. They arrived at their home, stopping outside to tend to the plants that had come out to greet them. Her manor was the largest green patch in the harbor, with every rainfall washing soil further out from Glaser's compost pile. The Dryad went over to examine a swale that she had fashioned a week previous, where the first set of shrubs was being tested for compatibility with her tree's ecology. One of them looked like it had been murdered by Lord Mayor's plants. Government can serve that purpose, Ludmilla said, but it is often not the best or most efficient actor in that regard. The best option is to have people observe boundaries out of their own free will. In order to have that happen, however, awareness of issues and an education that allows them to make effective decisions is necessary. Well, I say that, but many decisions are simple. For instance, people in a city will change their behavior if they are informed of events that impact themselves and their communities. Merchants may bring word of a poor harvest, or the local government will enact rationing measures to stave off mass starvation. Unfortunately, the reaction of the population is rarely uniform. Small, tightly knit communities like farming villages or frontier holdings tend to collaborate to ensure the community's survival, but larger populations that are made up of many communities, families, and individuals in isolation become a mess of competing interests. Survival instincts tend to be strong, so they begin to supersede measures to regulate undesirable behavior. As a dryad, which was a heteromorphic species that tended to live in isolation, population dynamics was a weak point in Glas's worldly understanding. Even after living in Warden's Vale for nearly a year, Ludmilla was fairly certain that her daughter framed the world around her in ways that were utterly alien to everyone else. The closest person to Glaser in mentality was probably Elishnish, who was also a heteromorph with a mostly solitary nature. So, when they reached that point, Glaser said, "Do they start fighting? There are bound to be plenty of weaklings that can be weeded out for the greater good of the population." "I am sure some people believe just that," Ludmilla replied. "But the weaklings in this case would only be weak when it comes to securing resources in that particular situation. Following that sort of logic will only result in a society where the strong rule over the weak. This is the state of most of the wilderness tribes that we have encountered." "What's wrong with that?" "You've mentioned a few times that forgetting how to fight and becoming weak leads to all sorts of problems." "I did," Ludmilla nodded, "but what qualifies as weakness varies from situation to situation. A society that prioritizes martial strength and considers creative pursuits a weakness will be doomed to having territorial expansion as the only means by which it can support a growing population. One that neglects martial strength becomes a token conquest for those that have not. Of course, a highly belligerent society can have the effect of forcing its neighbors onto the same path for survival, which can lead to entire regions becoming indefinitely locked into a state of slow to no progress in other fields. This is, in effect, what has happened in the Abelian wilderness and other places like it." "In that case," Glaser said, "what's your strategy for Warden's Vale?" "Warden's Vale gets to cheat." The red gold leaves on Glaser's head rustled as she looked up from her work with a frown. "Cheat?" "As far as I have seen," Ludmilla said, "the regional paradigm is grow or die. Both tribes and countries must grow or be overwhelmed by aggressive neighbors. This is especially the case when one has powerful demi-humans on their border, as it seems that no technological or economic advantage can adequately make up for the natural advantages that those races enjoy. The Sorceress Kingdom, however, is not chained to that paradigm. Our armed forces are peerless and the economic burden that the military imposes is extraordinarily light. As a result, the vast majority of our resources are dedicated to advancing our civilization in economic, industrial, and societal fields. Because of the advantage we enjoy, the strides that we take need not be tied to population growth. The effects of this cannot be understated. Perhaps most importantly, it divorces us from stresses that cause primal behaviors to unconsciously manifest, allowing us to create a culture where people can master their nature rather than be slaves to it. Glaser stood up and dusted off her hands. "I guess that makes sense. It's better than being little more than a pack of animals without ever realizing it." "I would say so," Ludmilla said. "There are many first steps to accomplishing this, which all involve laying down the cultural foundation for such a society. For the harbor, it means creating a place where people from all walks of life can exist alongside one another without the characteristic segregation that occurs between them. A cultural consciousness that is well informed of how the world around them works is instrumental in having people police their own behaviors." After checking on a few more things outside of the manor, Ludmilla went inside. She walked straight to the office to check with Nonna for any work that had come in. "Nonna," she said, "is there anything new that requires my attention?" "No," the elder lich didn't look up from her desk. "Elements throughout the territory have been unable to keep up with the recent surge in administrative efficiency." "That's good." "Is it?" Ludmilla rolled her eyes and left the office. As always, the administrative elder liches assumed that more was better, trying to squeeze as much as they could out of their respective jurisdictions. It was half a wonder that the imperial administration didn't lease them en masse. Back in the hall, Glaser was sweeping dirt and dead leaves away from the kitchen. The hall itself looked more outdoors than indoors, having grown a thick carpet of grass that Glaser identified as compatible with the other plants. It made for an interesting method to clean the place, as most things could simply be emptied onto the grass. Amelia had accidentally left her stockings there one night and they vanished by the time she woke up in the morning. Everything that Glaser adds to the ecosystem is pretty voracious. It may not be a bad thing to have this ecosystem integrated into other urban centers. Lord Mayor may have been planning just that. He presumably placed divine ash saplings around the Sorceress Kingdom for teleportation purposes, but most of the locations were towns. Erantle had its divine ash planted on the island in the center of the pond in the demi-human quarter. "I'm going to school now," Glaser said. "Have fun." Ludmilla smiled as she checked over the Dryad's appearance. "Are you going to be out until you come back from the Lizardman village?" Since it's ritual practice, things are probably going to run extra late. The last time, they used up all of our mana making cure disease scrolls. That seems prudent. You never know when you might need them." Glaser waved to her as she went out the door. Ludmilla returned to her office, determined to get ahead of her work. When the shrine spell, it was a handheld one, marked the dinner hour, she came out to mingle with her people. She found Olga and Raoul seated at a table in the square across from the restaurant with the most current rendition of the village's crab dinner. They started to rise at her approach, but she motioned for them to be at ease. "Good evening, Lady Zaradnik." "Good evening," Ludmilla replied. "How did today's practice match go?" The awkward silence was answer enough. It appeared that Raoul had lost again. Ludmilla pulled up a chair to sit between her two apprentice commanders. "Is he still holding back?" she asked. "He is," Olga answered. "He is half as aggressive as before." "He is right here," Raoul said. "No, he is not," Ludmilla replied. "He is still languishing in Loserland somewhere." Olga's mouth fell open at Ludmilla's verbal jab, but Raoul only pouted. A larger class of apprentice commanders couldn't come sooner. Ludmilla suspected that Raoul would have recovered far more quickly if there were other boys around to stoke his competitive spirit. "So," Ludmilla said, "what is the actual problem? I somehow do not think that you believe that you are being too aggressive." "I was too aggressive," Raoul replied. "I got too aggressive and it made me stupid. The Elder Lich is still angry at me for losing its skeletal dragon." "It got angry at you." "Not exactly. I apologized and it said that it was fine, but it was definitely depressed over it." "Can the undead even get depressed?" Olga frowned. "Of course they can," Ludmilla told her. "Still, it is not a reason for you to lose your aggression. Aggression is an essential facet of every commander. You must understand how to make it work for you, not avoid it. As for the skeletal dragon..." Ludmilla looked around the square, finding a group of necromancers enjoying their meal nearby. Isabella looked entirely focused on sucking the meat out of a crab leg. "Isabella." The necromancer froze and looked in her direction. "Do you know anyone who can create skeletal dragons?" Ludmilla asked. "Skeletal dragons? Yeah. Hold on." Ludmilla exchanged looks with Olga and Raoul. She hadn't expected the immediate response. "He's coming, my lady," Isabella called out. "He is?" Ludmilla glanced about. "Yeah. I told him that you wanted someone who could do the thing, so he's coming over to do the thing." "What is the thing?" She could only assume that Isabella didn't know what was involved in the creation of a skeletal dragon. Hopefully, they had what was required in Warden's Vale. "That's sudden," Ludmilla said. "What was he doing before?" "He runs a butcher shop somewhere in Carnassus," Isabella replied. "Easy way to get materials." "Yeah? I see. How long until he arrives?" "Well, I told him he could stay with us. That's all right, right?" "Yes, of course. My offer extends to everyone. So long as he follows the rules. I can prepare a place for him. In that case, he'll be dragging all of his crap with him. Give it a couple of months." "Are you sure you need to pack this much, my lady?" "I am going to be away for at least a week," Ludmilla replied. "Lady Shalltear mentioned visiting with Lady Aura and Lord Mayor, as well, so I will be traveling extensively." I wonder about that. What do you mean? Well, Willuvian said, Lady Aura and Lord Mayor come by at least once a week, don't they? They don't make a very big deal out of it. Half of the time, Lord Mayor ends up curling up with a book in the hall and falls asleep. That may be true, but you never know what will happen. You packed your campaign tent, my lady. I didn't pack it, the tent is always in there by default. Clara and the others always bring their essentials with them everywhere they go. Their essentials are nothing like your essentials, my lady. Ludmilla gave the half-elf maid a resentful look. It was said that a household took on the characteristics of their mistress, but she didn't think she was anywhere near so obstinate. Did you remember to pack the gifts? Yes. Is there any last-minute thing that needs to be done around the manor? This is the 5th time you've asked that, my lady. She sighed and looked out of her bedroom window. The sun was already peeking over the mountains across the river. Then I suppose I should get going, Ludmilla said. If anything comes up, have Nonna contact me via message. We will, my lady. Willuvian accompanied her out the door, seeing her off with a smile. Upon reaching the street outside of her manor, Ludmilla turned on her heel and headed northward at a brisk pace. Just a casual stroll to the realm of the gods. Was that correct? If she recalled correctly, the gods left their divine capital, Kamimiago, in the human realm. Clara had been there herself several times on pilgrimage and described it as a wondrous place. Unless it had wandered off somewhere without anyone noticing, it was still nestled in the heart of the theocracy's capital. She picked up her pace once she went beyond the edge of the village, activating her flight item and propelling herself over the barren landscape. In the span of a few minutes, she reached the northern point of the future city and made her way along the strip of land dividing the lake and the river. It was supposed to function as a route north in the far future, but, for the time being, it served as part of the endurance course for ranger training. I wonder what time I would make nowadays. Yelena still had the best time out of all of the trainees, while Leela was the slowest. At some point, she wanted to add checkpoints with archery components to add to the course's scoring system. A survival test was also in the works, but she was having a hard time figuring out a route that didn't disturb too many tribes. Maybe she could have them go back and forth between the Abelian hills. Instead, she reached the ravine at the northern end of the lake, hopping her way up the steep slopes that Moman had once ascended with her in his arms. Her past self would have never imagined that she would be doing the same thing one day, nor much of anything else that had happened since she set off for Rantle with darkness that day. The ravine route joined with the newly rebuilt bridge and she followed the paved road north to Vulcanheim County. She could almost hear half of the House of Lords complaining as she zipped by the rotting remains of farming villages abandoned generations ago. Fortunately, she had some staunch allies in the royal court who ensured that her territory would continue on its current course. Before crossing over into Vulcanheim County, Ludmilla ascended to an altitude of 100 meters. A part of her was tempted to stay at ground level so she could stop and speak with some of the villagers along the way, but she wasn't sure how they would react to her presence. Instead, she settled on scrutinizing the land and its people from above, trying to discern how the land consolidation measures were coming along. I pity the local magistrates when the harvest comes. Even the slightest discrepancies are going to raise all sorts of conflicts. It was confusing to look down at as it was, with formerly separate strips of land now being worked as single tenancies. They could have just waited until the winter to redistribute the land, but everyone feared that Lady Albedo would try to push her Land Reorganization Act through in the interim. Ludmilla wasn't so sure that the Prime Minister would do such a thing, but, then again, she had never met the woman in person. That is something else to look forward to during this visit. The entire royal court is supposed to be participating in this tournament. It took nearly an hour to cross Vulcanheim County relying solely on the power of her flight item, then another hour to cross over Jesn County. She cut across the countryside north of Rantle, staying far away from the restricted zone around Carney village. From her vantage, however, she could see rows of barracks-like buildings outside of a sturdy-looking wall. It didn't look anything like the humble farming village that it was supposed to be. At one point, she wanted to speak with the bloody general who led the goblin army stationed there, but access to the village was barred to nearly everyone. Lady Shalltear later told her that the goblins' army's goblins weren't regular goblins, whatever that meant. She also mentioned that the bloody general wasn't a professional officer and had no interest in serving in the royal army. so Ludmilla had given up on the idea. As she cut her way northeast over pastures dotted with cattle, her destination grew closer. She had already seen it many times from a distance while flying from place to place, and one could even spot it from the heights of the mountains near her home. If she were to describe it, it was as if someone had cut off the top of a hill and exposed a pristine mausoleum inside. A log cabin incongruously sat outside at the foot of the hill, and Ludmilla alighted on the grass not far from its door. "Someone is supposed to meet me here, I think." A moment later, the door to the cabin opened and a familiar maid with golden hair and eyes emerged. "Miss Sixes," Ludmilla smiled in greeting, "it's been a few days." "Baroness Zaradnik." The maid lowered herself into a deep curtsy. "This Sixes has the honor of staffing the surface entrance while the Pleiades are participating in the tournament." "You aren't participating yourself?" "Me?" The maid tittered. "Perish the thought, my lady. We homunculus maids aren't much stronger than the average human." Homunculus? She wasn't sure what that was. Her true sight didn't reveal anything strange about Miss Sixes, so she had always assumed that His Majesty's regular household maids were humans. Then again, she hadn't ever seen a footman from His Majesty's household staff, which was decidedly strange. Maybe everyone in Nazarick was some kind of heteromorph who had served the Sorcerer King for untold human generations. "You must want to spectate, at least," Ludmilla said. "Ah, yes," Miss Sixes said, "I can't wait to witness our older sister's gallantry. I was instructed to close things up here once you arrived, so I'll be going to the arena after getting some food from the cafeteria." "In that case, I shouldn't keep you waiting." "Thank you for your consideration, my lady. Welcome to the Great Tomb of Nazarick. Please, follow me." Ludmilla fell into step behind Miss Sixes and followed her into the cabin. The interior was sparse in its furnishings, with a single chair at a table by the building's single window. Aside from that, there was a tall dresser placed against the back wall. The maid pulled the doors open, revealing the swirling darkness within. "A gate?" "Yes, my lady," Miss Sixes nodded. "Stepping through will bring you to the outside of Lady Shalltear's personal chambers on the second floor." Had she heard everything correctly? She was probably missing some crucial context, but she wasn't about to make Miss Sixes wait. The darkness of the cabin was replaced by an even deeper darkness the moment she stepped through the portal. A vampire bride bowed low in greeting as she gained her bearings. "Welcome, Lady Zaradnik," she said. "We've been expecting you. Our mistress awaits you inside." Ludmilla started to follow the vampire bride, but then she stopped at the beginning of an extraordinarily dubious-looking rope bridge. Every second plank was missing, and the ones that remained looked like they were on the verge of rotting apart. Below the bridge was a pit or moat containing some sort of abomination made up of a mass of limbs and pallid flesh. The vampire bride stopped to look over her shoulder. "Is something the matter, my lady? Is this a proper thoroughfare?" Ludmilla asked, "or some sort of defensive structure?" "It is intended to be the latter," the vampire bride answered. "What do you think of it?" Most people that she knew would immediately seek another way across, if not give up entirely upon seeing what lurked below, but would be incapable of challenging Lady Shalltear care about such a paltry defense. They would probably just fly or jump over to the other side. "It feels like something is missing," Ludmilla said. "Ah, so you noticed? The mercenaries who are supposed to be guarding the bridge are currently deactivated." "Mercenaries? Deactivated? I must be missing something." The vampire bride resumed walking. Ludmilla carefully picked her way across the bridge, but the footing was more solid than expected. On the other side of the moat was a gatehouse door fashioned out of glossy black wood. Framing it was a wall of grey stone fashioned in a way reminiscent of a catacomb or sewer. A sweet fragrance drifted past her as the door creaked open and lurid red light leaked out into the surroundings. Ludmilla brushed aside the chiffon veils hanging from the ceiling as she followed the vampire bride inside. "This greatly resembles Lady Shalltear's court atop Calling Castle," Ludmilla said. "We modeled it after the Adipocere chamber, after all." Ludmilla eyed the pale walls of the corridor, wondering if it was truly constructed out of its namesake. She tentatively held her fingers out to touch a column along the way, then retracted them. "It was probably better not to know. The fragrance that you use here isn't quite the same as the other place," she noted. "Fragrance? Ah. This is actually a poisonous gas with several powerful debilitating effects. It's also a strong aphrodisiac. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any similar products in the markets." Maybe we'll have some luck in the future. Let's hope not. Her friends all had items that conferred poison immunity, but one never knew what would happen in Lady Shalltear's court. The maids who waited on them in the antechambers weren't protected from poison, either. The corridor reached a junction of three enfilades obscured by the same sheer veils that were draped over the way-in. Soft murmurs of women carried through the air from either side, punctuated by laughter, gasps, and the occasional drawn-out moan. Ludmilla kept her eyes on the details of the chamber, which was set up as a luxurious lounge. A few vampire brides were relaxing around the room, playing games, reading, or chatting with one another while sipping on crystal chalices filled with crimson liquid. "Do all of you reside here?" Ludmilla asked. "Technically, yes," the vampire bride guiding her replied. "But most of us are currently posted at our stations around Nazarick and the Sorceress Kingdom. Would you like it if your personal facilities abroad looked more like this?" The vampire bride stopped and tilted her head in thought, then looked over at a group of her fellow handmaidens nearby. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think what we have around the Sorceress Kingdom is sufficient," one of them said. "We spend our time off of work shopping," said another. "Or working in our new boutiques," another added. "I see," Ludmilla said. "Even so, let us know if there's anything you want. Everyone's been working so hard for the Ministry of Transportation that it wouldn't be wrong to have something nice for yourselves." They always insisted that they had everything that they needed, but it was clear that they each had desires of their own. She considered encouraging them to open the new boutiques a major victory, but that had just turned into another way to work. "How is Coven doing, anyway?" Ludmilla asked. Coven was the name of the brand that Lady Shalltear and her handmaidens had started early in the summer. It was ostensibly a fashion line, but what Ludmilla had seen of their products so far made her wonder if they would be able to send anything at all. Never mind that, she didn't know how anyone could dare to be seen entering a shop with such a brazen display. "Business is steady." "Ah, really?" Ludmilla frowned. "Only married women frequent the boutiques in Corlin County, but were much more popular amongst the women of the city and the northern towns. Lady Shalltear referred the brothels to us, as well. As soon as people get some discretionary income, they spend it on the most ridiculous things, not that it was something she could cast stones about. Her best set of underwear was just as scandalous as those on Coven's storefront displays, and it was a part of her combat equipment, as well." Lady Shalltear insisted that it was battlefield equipment, but Ludmilla was certain that there was a translation error somewhere in her liege's statement. "Even when you come here for leisure," Lady Shalltear's voice sounded from further inside the chamber, "you're all business. You and Clara really are like peas in a pod." She scanned the lounge, searching for her liege. "In here," Lady Shalltear's voice came from the central enfilade. Ludmilla went over and poked her head into the next chamber. There, Lady Shalltear was wrapped in a towel, laying back on a long leather chair. "Good morning, Lady Shalltear." Ludmilla lowered her head in a curtsy. "If you don't mind my asking, what are those things covering your eyes?" "They are cucumber slices, and the, mask on your face?" The pair of cucumber slices turned to look in her direction. "Can't you see that I'm getting a facial?" Lady Shalltear's slender hand gestured loosely about the room. "I'm in a salon and everything." Little about the room was familiar to her aside from the mirrors mounted on the walls. Ludmilla walked out onto the polished floor, examining the various contraptions spread around the place. "Lady Shalltear," one of the vampire brides from the lounge said, "we've discovered that beauty salons don't exist in the region as we know them." "They don't? Why didn't you say so earlier? We need to add salons to our boutiques as soon as possible." "This one doesn't believe the technology exists to make this type of salon work here, Lady Shalltear," the vampire bride said. "Just make do with what we can figure out," Lady Shalltear said. "Beauty is serious business." The vampire brides in the lounge leapt out of their seats and started running about. A few of them came into the salon, taking notes of every detail. "With this," Lady Shalltear declared from her leather throne in a triumphant tone, "our conquest of the world will begin." "I'm not sure that something like this can conquer the world, my lady," Ludmilla said. "Just you wait and see." Ludmilla stared at the perfectly manicured finger wagging at her. Did vampires even need beauty treatments? Thanks to her nature as a revenant, Ludmilla didn't have to do anything to maintain her appearance, which of course drove all of her friends up a wall. "Why are you doing all of this, anyway?" Ludmilla asked. Don't you have a tournament match coming up? Combat had a way of ruining any beauty treatments. Then again, what she saw before her may very well be magical in nature. After a moment's thought, she decided that it was highly likely. I need to look my best before Lord Ines, Lady Shalltear told her. My upcoming match is against that gorilla. I shall deliver an absolute defeat. She idly wondered if the Prime Minister was getting a manicure and facial, as well. The tournament was shaping up to be a multi-layered competition. Have you taken a look around, yet? Lady Shalltear asked. I'm going to be stuck here for a few hours. You show her around? Yes, Lady Shalltear. The vampire bride led her back out of the adipocere chamber and over the bridge. They stopped near the spot where they had arrived, which looked suspiciously like an alcove in a catacomb. What would you like to see first, my lady? The vampire bride asked. I'm not sure, Ludmilla said. I believe I was teleported here. What does it look like outside? Outside? The vampire bride blinked several times before stepping onto the teleportation spot. She gestured for Ludmilla to join her. Once she did, the dark, cramped corridor was replaced by a chamber with daylight spilling in from one end. Ludmilla stepped past an ornate sarcophagus to look outside, finding the pristine mausoleum grounds from before. I meant Lady Shalltear's territory, Ludmilla said. As in outside of her home. Yes, my lady, the vampire bride said. This is the outside of our home. So she lives in the so-called realms below? Lady Shalltear had mentioned that the surface complex was the entrance to her domain, but provided few details beyond that. If it is your desire, the vampire bride said, we can walk back to the adipocere chamber from here. I'd like that. The vampire bride gestured back toward the building they had stepped out of. She spotted an ominous-looking stairwell past the sarcophagi inside. Down here? Ludmilla asked. Yes, my lady, the vampire bride answered. After 2 turns of the stairwell, the pristine stonework of the surface complex was replaced with the same catacomb theme that she saw outside of Lady Shalltear's home. A long hall lined with stone caskets greeted her at the bottom of the stairs. Strangely, every figure carved upon them was human in appearance. As they proceeded further in, the corridor branched once, then twice. The clatter of skeletal feet sounded from a distance, growing louder until a patrol of undead rounded the corner. Ludmilla scrutinized their familiar armament, which was aglow in energies from every pole of the elemental axis. These are Nazarick old guarders? She said as she pressed against the wall to let them pass. Yes, there are several hundred patrolling this floor. I believe most of the rest have been deployed to the Lizardman Alliance village. There were other defenders, as well, including the shadow demons working for the Department of Transportation and Foreign Affairs. It sounds like you've relocated much of your labor pool, Ludmilla said. Has that affected your domestic industries in any way? She wasn't sure if they had conventional territory, never mind domestic industries, but she didn't know how else to frame her queries. A different group of denizens handles our domestic industries. So they do have them. If it is allowed, Ludmilla said, may I see some of them? Based on my discussions with Lady Shalltear since we met, it seems that how things work here are far different than in the world above. Of course, my lady, the vampire bride said. This way, please. The vampire bride led her through dozens of twists and turns. They eventually arrived at a small cemetery illuminated by the sickly green torches that the adventurer training area often used in its script runs. Another vampire bride stood at the entrance with a wooden bucket and a knife. More importantly, why is there a cemetery inside a catacomb? Another thing was added to the rapidly growing doesn't make any sense pile. This is one of the cemeteries, the vampire bride said. We harvest several crops here. Foremost among them is grave moss, which is collected once every 24 hours. That's some fast-growing moss. Ludmilla eyed the grey-green patches clinging to each tombstone. Is there a specific name for this species? Grave moss, just grave moss? Yes, my lady. Countless types of mosses could grow on tombstones, any moss that could grow on stone, really, so there had to be a proper name for it. What is this grave moss for? It is an alchemical reagent. I see. So you create potions with it? Or maybe a salve? No. It is delivered directly to the Treasury, where it contributes to funding Nazarick's operations. So the Treasury organizes its processing into alchemical goods. No, my lady. The grave moss becomes funds. The royal treasurer personally sees to it funding Nazarick's operations. Ludmilla resisted the urge to scratch her head in confusion. One didn't simply send unprocessed goods to a treasury for conversion into funds. Maybe they just didn't know what happened to the goods. It would be in line with Lady Shalltear's poor understanding of conventional industry. What else does this cemetery produce? Ludmilla asked. Corpse blossoms, razor grass, and grave dust. The corpse blossoms take the longest to harvest, needing a week to mature. What do they go toward? They are delivered to the treasury, where they contribute to funding Nazarick's operations. I don't suppose the royal treasurer sees to it personally. Yes, my lady. Our next industrial facility is nearby. This way, please. As Ludmilla followed the vampire bride to the next location, she pondered the enigmatic process that was claimed to fund their territorial actions. A thread of concern developed for her liege when it came to the fact that the royal treasurer seemingly produced funds out of thin air. That sort of behavior tended to indicate an abuse of power, so it was possible that Lady Shalltear was being cheated in some way. Their next stop was a spider web woven over a dark pit. Directly in the center of the web was a black spider with red and purple mottling on its carapace. Its 8 eyes shone in the dim lighting as it looked directly at them. This is one of Grant's lairs, the vampire bride's voice echoed off at the far end of the chamber. She has one on each floor of Lady Shalltear's domain. As you can see, Grant is sitting in the middle of the web. Grant, this is Ludmilla Nazarick, the new area guardian who joined us last spring. Grant raised a spindly leg and waved. Ludmilla waved back. Grant is the area guardian for all of her lairs, the vampire bride told her. Regrettably, we haven't had any intruders worthy of her attention recently. You mentioned that this was an industrial facility, as well? Yes, one of the workers is descending the web over there. Halfway to the center of the web, another vampire bride was casually strolling on one of the strands of silk leading to Grant. As Ludmilla's eyes followed her to see what she was doing, she gradually realized just how large Grant was. The vampire brides were roughly as tall as Leanne or Florine, and it looked like the one below was the same size as one of Grant's glistening mandibles. Her body alone must be around 20 meters long. Each of Grant's legs was twice the length of her body. Overall, she made the cliff tarantulas in the southern imperial frontier look like baby spiders in comparison. Underneath the colossal spider, the vampire bride wrapped her arms around a silk cocoon nearly as large as she was and picked it up. I suppose that's the product? Ludmilla asked. Yes, my lady. I've heard of fabrics woven out of spider silk in my reading. Is that what happens to it? No. It is delivered directly to the treasury, where it contributes to funding Nazarick's operations. Right. The vampire bride carrying the cocoon offered a greeting as she walked by them. Ludmilla was tempted to follow her to see what happened to the silk. By the time they returned to the Adipocere chamber, she had taken a look at 5 more industrial facilities, all of which produced goods which the royal treasurer personally handled. She debated whether to broach the topic with Lady Shalltear as they walked into the chamber's lounge again. She was snapped out of her thoughts as a vampire bride came out of the salon and clapped her hands. All right everyone, she called out, it's time for the pre-match orgy. The what? Ludmilla nearly shouted. What better way to motivate our mistress? The vampire bride told her. Lady Nazarick, you can wait for us in Lady Shalltear's chambers while we bring in the equipment. It's at the end of the way behind me. Her surroundings came alive with activity as the vampire brides excitedly went about making their preparations. With a long sigh, Ludmilla walked out of the lounge and through the salon, wondering what sort of insanity she had just been wrangled into. After going through several more chambers, she ended up in a girlish bedroom with a large, canopied bed. A table had been set for tea to the side and a Lady Shalltear-sized desk was placed against the wall on one side of the bed. Several cabinets and dressers lined the rest of the room. This is far more modest than I expected. It's about the size of Clara's old room. No, wait, this isn't the time to be thinking about that. Ludmilla paced back and forth around the room, restlessly scanning her surroundings. Lady Shalltear had suggested that they have a few vampire brides join them in bed on several occasions, but Ludmilla had always politely refused. Now, it seemed that she was about to be buried in them. As she continued pacing, she noticed one of the dressers had opened a crack. She idly reached out to shut it as she passed, and then a thump spun her around. It looked like the dresser door had bounced open from her attempt to close it. On the ground was a dark shroud draped over what could only be a body. A pair of strangely familiar legs stuck out of the bottom. "Ludmilla," Lady Shalltear's silvery voice chimed from the bedroom door, "are you Reed?" The shrouded corpse vanished from the floor. A violent wham sounded from the dresser beside her. Ludmilla stared at Lady Shalltear. "Lady Shalltear? Why, yes? That was my corpse, wasn't it?" Lady Shalltear fell silent, her crimson gaze wandering around the room. The problematic door swung open again, and the body inside fell out, rolling once over the carpet. The action unraveled the shroud. Ludmilla stared at the corpse, finding her own face staring back at her. "I was right," she said. "I really can't trust you with my body." "What?" Lady Shalltear protested. "I'm taking good care of it. I always put it in a shroud of sleep when it isn't being used, and I always make sure to clean it up after I use it. And were you going to use it this time around, as well?" "Maybe." Tears welled up in Ludmilla's eyes. This was too much. The prospect of being involved in an orgy with dozens of vampire brides was daunting enough, never mind being involved in an orgy with her own corpse. Ludmilla sniffed and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand before heading for the door. "I'm going home," she said.